Good morning, everyone. My name is Valentine of the Biomatter Research Group, Faculty of Engineering at the Free University of Brussels in Belgium. Right, and it's my privilege to have the opportunity to address us regarding some of the tips I think will be invaluable in facilitating the successful publication of manuscripts, specifically in peer-reviewed scientific journals. Right. Now, during the course of this discussion, I would like to call it discussion rather than a presentation, right? We'll be exploring several aspects of within the context of this topic, right? So we will be assessing when to publish, when do we feel we are ready to publish, possible reasons for publishing, right? Before we translate to the notable publishing tips that I think will be very useful, and of course, we'll zero in on the ethics of scientific writing. Now, when do we publish? Now, the first thing we need to understand is that scientific research seeks to introduce novel aspects to existing work, right? So you are trying to avoid a scenario where you are replicating things that we know already. For instance, my background is chemical engineering, and in chemical engineering, we know how to define or design distillation columns. Now, writing a journal paper or drafting a manuscript that focuses on drafting distillation columns will not be valuable in terms of novelty. Like, there's no novelty in such studies, right? So it is crucial that whatever you are trying to publish, you feel crucially based on the existing body of knowledge that what you are trying to publish is relatively new, right? The next thing you need to find out is, does your research team align with the current hot topic? Like, is it a relevant study in present day 2021, right? For instance, there was a time ethanol production from sugarcane bagasse was considered a hot topic. That was like in the early 90s or the late 90s, early 2000s, right? Right now it is not, because there are alternative ways of producing liquid fuels that have even higher energy densities, right? So you need to make sure that your research or what you're trying to publish, right, the research team you're trying to publish aligns with the current trends, right? You need to go with the flow. Now, you also need to ensure that you are able to solve some existing problems, right? So if there's an existing technology that has an issue, for instance, I specialize in biorefinery design, and we find out that there's a way you can, optimize, say, economics without circumventing the need for enhanced environmental performance, right? That could be something that is publishable, for a particular case scenario for your process flow diagram, right? So you need to know, is your research good enough to solve an existing problem? It needs to capture the audience. You need to have an opportunity, or you need to present the opportunity where people feel there's value in your work, right? And of course, before you publish anything, I keep saying, and I tell my students, before you publish, it is crucial that you are confident in your results. You need to be sure of what you are dealing with, because publishing or trying to publish data that may have some inconsistencies does greater harm than good in the long term, right? So if all the questions, all the answers to these particular questions are yes, then that is excellent. We are ready to publish. Now, why are we publishing, right? Now, it is clear that no matter how beautiful your work is, no matter how excellent your research work is, no matter how many experiments you have done, beautiful equipment, high-level technical input you have introduced to your work, now if you do not publish, first and foremost, nobody knows what you have done. Your work will be gathering up dust in some library somewhere, or perhaps your thesis somewhere or in your system, and at the end of the day, you have not made an impact to the scientific world, right? The body of knowledge you met still exists as it was, right? So it is crucial that you find a way to document your research results via publications, right? Typically, using peer-reviewed journal papers are encouraged because, unlike book chapters and other online form of knowledge dissemination, your journal papers are typically peer-reviewed. Of course, the authentic ones, right? And when you are peer-reviewed, you have the opportunity to get some kind of feedback during the peer review process. So there's critical feedback from the reviewers regarding ways that you can improve the manuscript, right? And of course, regarding possible limitations of your work, right, or inconsistencies in your data, right? Now, you must understand that the fundamental reason for us to undertake research should be to increase knowledge, more or less, contribute to the existing body of knowledge, so that for the benefit of humanity. We're trying to make things better, right? So if you have results that you are confident of and you believe that they can impact, life in some way, right, then why keep it hidden, right? So this should justify your publishing. Of course, we cannot ignore the fact that publishing research helps with career development. Typically, when you publish a lot in a particular field, you kind of establish yourself as an expert in that field, right? Providing evidence that you can undertake future work in that area in different sectors, right? So you have the opportunity to, advance in your career. Clearly, you can use the evidence of publications as a application tool for funding, and new funding application to funding bodies. So the benefits are far-reaching. Of course, we cannot forget the phrase "publish or perish," right? It is clear that if you do not publish, you kind of stagnate yourself because you are not creating knowledge, and if you are not creating knowledge, it is difficult to justify your place in the academia, right? You need to be creating knowledge and making it available for the public in a way that experts in your field can understand the technical basis of your work, and of course the general public can also understand the general idea of what you're trying to say, right? They may not understand the technical undertones of work, but they need to understand the general idea you're trying to present, right? Now, briefly, we're going to discuss these notable publishing tips I am supposed to focus on, right? Now, these tips are tips that have helped me and I believe can also help you too, right? Now, the first tip is utilize an impactful title. Now, you need a title that is not only catchy but impactful, right? You need a title. Now, when I say impactful, I'm not really concerned about the length of the title. Of course, you should realize that for most journals there's a character limit to the manuscript title, right? But the title should be impactful. At a glance, an individual should be able to, or the reader should be able to understand what you are trying to communicate, right? They should be able to understand what you're trying to sell, the idea you're trying to sell, right? Now, if the title is not catchy, the chances of the manuscript being read and perhaps cited is just a little bit slimmer, right? So you need to make it catchy, impactful, and very clear. Of course, I will also encourage that when you draft your manuscript, you utilize a lot of figures, right? Graphs, tables, because these tend to better convey information, or rather they convey information faster, right? So rather than writing so many lines trying to say something that you can just capture with, say, a pie chart, for instance, in the simplest form, right? You can just use your images and move on, right? Again, images tend to be schematics, figures, and tables tend to be very catchy and straight to the point, right? They present your results or your information in a very condensed and neat manner, right? Of course, like I said before, it is crucial that what you are doing or what you are trying to publish is considered novel. It needs to be novel, robust, significant, and solve a particular problem, problem in that particular field that you are in, right? Of course, I also encourage people, my colleagues, my students, to try to share their work with colleagues, right? Now, before you consider sending it for review or submitting it to a journal or the journal for review, it is crucial that your colleagues have a chance to have a read, because they will look at it with no emotions and tell you their honest opinion regarding the quality of the paper, right? Because sometimes when you have written a paper, you tend to overlook some of the inadequacies because you tend to have, I dare say, a pseudo emotional bond to that manuscript, right? So it is always best that you allow people that are colleagues in the field to critique your work, right? Now, if you are just beginning in the academia or in the research arena, I always encourage that you try to collaborate with experts in the field, because nothing beats experience, right? The more experience you have in a particular research area, the more you're able to detect inadequacies or inconsistencies in data, the more and the easier you are able to identify, logic flaws in the discussions of results, and all that, right? So being able to collaborate with people that are more experienced than you in the research field goes a long way, right? So making sure that you get your paper published. And another trick is just to recognize that there are some journals that will tend to give more credence to your data and your results when they see that it has been critiqued. Because of course, if you have co-authors, collaborators on the list of authors, it suggests that they have had a read of the paper, so they would have critiqued the paper initially before even sending it. So that gives the journal more confidence in your work, the reviewer has more confidence in your work, right? So that's another added advantage. Of course, we also need to recognize that when writing or drafting a journal paper, you must conform to the traditional structure or the conventional structure of scientific writing, right? So you need to have the materials, an introductory section, a material and method section, results, discussion of results, and of course the consequences, right? Of more or less what are you getting from this work, right? Right. Of course, some journals tend to have a different structure. I've seen a few journals that tend to go from introduction straight to the results, then they have the material section and the discussions. So you still need to align with the structure proposed by the journal and then submit your manuscript to. However, it is best that your first draft has a structure so that whoever reads it can understand the underlying story of the manuscript, right? It is crucial, right? Like I said, ultimately you need to align your manuscript to the target journal, because typically there's a new system now utilized by Elsevier. I think it's called Fast Reject. So you submit a manuscript for review and they look at certain key points. Is it aligned to the structure of the existing of the journal, right? If it's not, they reject it, without even sending it for review, right? Now, for reviews, when I mean reviews, I mean like literature reviews, not research papers, review articles rather, right? So for review articles, this may not necessarily be crucial, but sometimes, right, especially if you are trying to submit to a very high impact factor journal, say from 7 upwards, it is best to fill I call it testing the water, right? So I suggest you send an email to the editor, the chief editor, with the abstract and the title, the tentative title, and the tentative abstract, because this may change, right? And find out if it is a kind of manuscript that they may be keen or they may be keen to consider for review in that particular journal, right? Because some journals tend to have strict regulations with respect to reviews, like review papers with respect to the word counts, the sectioning, number of figures. But recently, I submitted a manuscript where they made sure that one of the conditions was that the number of figures and tables combined should not be more than 8, right? So there are journals like that. So it's best that you send an email to the editor to assess the interest in your work. Are they interested in reviewing this, right? Now, when you have submitted your manuscript for review, typically you get responses from the reviewers regarding points, inconsistencies, possible parts that can be improved, or sections of the manuscript that can be improved. Right now, it is incumbent on you to seek ways to respond in a polite and intelligent manner, right? Now, sometimes we have had experiences, or I have had personal experiences, where reviewers make comments that, quite frankly, are not may not necessarily be true, right? Make arguments that may not necessarily be logical, in my opinion. Now, it is your job to understand that, first, the reviewer is reviewing your document for free. Second, the reviewer is most likely an expert in your field, so he should know, or he or she should know more, like is expected. And thirdly, even if the reviewer does not maybe know that particular area, because you did the research, you may know certain aspects that he may not know. It is your job to explain, to make the reviewer understand what you are trying to say, right? You do not try to argue unnecessarily with the reviewer. You try to be polite, right? Understand it's unpaid work, right? And reviewing manuscripts takes time if it's to be done properly, right? Unpaid man hours, right? Now, finally, I always encourage us to proofread, because errors are consistently observed in journal papers. I've made a few myself in the past, so it is best that you read through, make sure typos are not minimized. Typos are minimized, your equations are accurate, you have the right sentences for the right ideas that you're trying to pass on, right? So it is crucial that you proofread your document. I always also encourage colleagues and students that you give it time. What I mean is, you write, you've done everything you need to do, you're sure it's done, you leave the document somewhere away from yourself for 2 or 3 days, then come back to it, right? Because that way you are looking at it with fresh eyes, in quotes, right? So you are in a better position to see if there are flaws, simple errors that can be easily corrected. I do not encourage excessive use of abbreviations. I try to limit them as much as possible. Of course, if you have to use abbreviations, if you must, for instance, utilizing an abbreviation for a word that is particularly long, Now, it is crucial that you understand that when publishing, you must avoid the temptation to plagiarize or to duplicate existing work, right? Now, there's nothing wrong with utilizing existing work as a basis to build on yours, right? That is creativity, but you must reference your source. For instance, you're trying to bake castle bread. Somebody previously baked chair bread, right? You reference that Mark, for instance, according to Mark, the chair bread had issues with respect to mechanical strength and stability. So you are now suggesting baking castle bread, right? You have based your work on a previous work that has already been done, but you have given the right level of acknowledgement for that work. It is crucial that you avoid plagiarism in all forms. We have had so many stories of journals, of careers ending, right, in the academia due to plagiarism, right? Students' degrees, withdrawn due to plagiarism in their thesis. So we must avoid plagiarism in all forms, right? And of course, we should be clear that you only introduce co-authors that contribute substantially to the work. You do not consider publications as gifts, right? Publishing is serious business, right? So you need to be able to ensure that only substantial contributors to the work exist in your publication list, like in your co-authors list. Sorry about that. Co-author list, right? You need to ensure that only substantial contributors are parts and parcel of that publication, right? Of course, if somebody or an individual contributed in some way, you can still introduce the person in the acknowledgement section of your manuscript. Right now, when we have done all this, well, you can now be congratulated and you're ready, more or less ready to publish your paper, because that's all, right? Follow these steps, and I expect that, for the most part, your paper should be accepted. Now, I will encourage us to have a quick look at this was a certain article I had to read just to get some ideas to summarize my thoughts, right? But it's a very nice article, so we should have a quick look at this perhaps later on. Try to follow the steps there. This is written by a presenter from Sylvia, which is one of the respected publishers of journal papers. So please have a look, and thank you for listening. Bye bye.